All right, so we're on our last week. Just a couple of chapters and we'll be done with the semester. So that went by pretty quick, didn't it? It went by really quick for me too. So these won't be nearly as long as the previous ones, probably just one section per chapter. There's only like 50 slides per thing. So we're just gonna do this all in one video per chapter, all right? So we're gonna, in chapter unit 2 or 3 actually, we're going to talk about water relations, mineral nutrition, a little bit about fertility. The learning outcomes are going to be describe the characteristics of water, the forces that move and hold that water, how water enters the plant, transpiration, mineral transport of minerals and sugars. So water is going to be 90% of the plant's mass. The rest of it is going to, of that other 10% is going to be those carbon structures, cellulose, lignin, some fats and lipids, things we talked about in Unit 1. Water is necessary for germination. So imbibition is the very first step to seed germination. And it also kind of holds our cells, kind of gives them some structure as well. So like a full cell that has enough water in it is going to be it's going to be full, right? And so it will, if you get enough cells together, there's not a lot of room, and so we have a nice strong plant. It's important for mineral and photosynthesis, as I just mentioned, and then also cooling is part of that transpiration. So that's kind of the same thing. Again, I relate that back to plants and humans actually having some similarities, in that when they get too hot, they transpire or sweat, which is what we do. Like when we get too hot, we transpire some of that heat out of our skin. So some of the things about water is that it is a universal solvent. The structure of it is dipolar, so we have 2 hydrogens on the bottom that have a positive charge and then a negative charge on the other end of that oxygen. And so what this means is that these molecules can then be attached to each other because of the charge. So they, each water molecule binds well with itself, or is attracted to its own self. As I mentioned before, that it is dipole. Wherever the hydrogens are closer, we're going to have that more positive charge with that negative charge on the other end. And as I mentioned, that we get that attraction to other water molecules. But this also, the way that the charges are set up or distributed, it allows us to attract those cations and anions. So those cations or anions can be dissolved in that water. When they are dissolved in the water, the plants can then take them up. We also have this surface tension, which is what allows our soil to hold that water. This also allows the water to reach the top of the trees. So here in a few moments, I'll show you a slide about how this whole soil plant water continuum kind of goes together. So we have characteristics, kind of the 3 phases of water are going to be liquid, solid, and gas, or has a high specific heat. So this is going to be evaporation. So water, the mass cannot change, cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change state. So it is either going to be in one of these 3 forms. Here is the graphic that I was talking about. So we have water in the soil, and it's filling these micropores. And if you look closely, you can see that this water is entering into the xylem. And because water has that bonding ability with itself and also with other substances or structures, adhesion and cohesion allow that water to move up the tree or the plant through the xylem, right? And it is trying to get out the top, which is the transpiration. And so on the left side of this picture, we can see, if you look down here, our water potential is negative 0.3. So this is like field capacity. If you look at the top of the tree, the outside area is negative 100 megapascals. Water always wants to move to the area of more negative pressure. So we have pressure here, it moves up the tree, and then finally out of the top. As I mentioned, it's going to carry some of those minerals that are dissolved in there, and it can move as a vapor or a liquid through the soil pores, so it doesn't necessarily have to be in what we would typically consider water. Some of those minerals may be, if the temperature gets too hot, the water will change phase into a gas phase and move to an area of lower or more negative potential. It's also possible that when it gets to that area of negative pressure, that the temperature changes and then it moves from a vapor back to a liquid. When all our pores are filled, all our soil pore space is filled, we will call that saturated. If it is saturated, then that means that there is no oxygen. So most of the there might be a little oxygen trapped in there. That is possible to have some oxygen trapped in the soil, in the water, as little bubbles. But that's not going to be good because there's no oxygen for root respiration. So those plant metabolic processes are then minimized, and the plant could eventually die. Likewise, when there's no water, it'll be too dry for plant growth, and what we have is we get this embolism, and so plants are like a straw, and so they're continuously sucking moisture from the soil to move out the top, right? So you can almost think about this as a straw, that because this potential is so great, this negative 100 megapascals, or what we might call bars, so this is going to continuously happen. Well, eventually, if there's no water in the soil, eventually this negative pressure will become air, and it will start to pull the air out of the soil. And so what happens is kind of like an embolism is what it's called. So I worked with cattail on my PhD, and it's a water-loving plant, and so if you pull it out of the water and then don't put it back in water as you're transplanting it, it will continue to suck air and get a bubble in it. And when it gets the bubble, it's just kind of like if we get a bubble in our bloodstream, we can end up dying from that. So the same things can happen in plants. We talked about soil pore space a little bit earlier. We got our clay soils and our sandy soils. That's going towards our texture. And then the clay soils can hold more water than sandy soils because they have more of these smaller pores. And so they have a greater water holding capacity. And I mean, in soils, we like to keep things pretty simple. It's just the amount of water that a soil can hold, right? However, when we're in the soil, there are three primary forces that are responsible for the movement of water in the soil and through the soil. So first is gravimetric, or gravity. So as the soil begins to fill, it rains a long enough extended period of time such that all the pore space is filled. Eventually, gravity will percolate. The water will percolate because of the gravity. Next, we have adhesion, and adhesion is the attraction between unlike molecules. So when I think about adhesion, I think about like a piece of tape, right? A piece of tape can stick to several different surfaces because it has an adhesive on it. And so this would be like the water with the soil particles. And then we have cohesion, which is the force of attraction between like molecules, which makes sense, right? So as a cohesive unit, And when I think about that, like I think about maybe you've seen the movie 300, and so there are all these soldiers, and they're all and they move as a cohesive unit. They move together. So it's the attraction between like molecules. So water to water. Because of those three forces, what we have is capillary action. And so because we have adhesion and cohesion, we can have what we call capillary rise. And if you look over here on this picture, we have this very small diameter tube, and the water is able to move up the tube because of adhesion and also cohesion. So we have water molecules that are binding or attracted to the sides of the glass, and because we have cohesion, they're pulling other water molecules with it. However, the larger the tube, the less the attraction and the less capillary rise. So you would not have as much capillary rise in a sandy soil because that pore space is large. But you would have a large capillary rise in, let's say, a silt loam, or maybe even a clay. It may take longer, but you would have more capillary rise, like overall. This is also kind of the reason why it's not raining. So let's say you wear a pair of jeans and it's not raining outside, like actually raining, but because you have been walking around puddles and whatnot, and at least some moisture is touching the bottom of your jeans, that water starts to rise up your jean pants. So that's capillary rise. And so the way we describe that is with this, we describe it by water potential, and that is symbolized by the Greek letter psi. And so that psi represents the changes in the energy level of the water. And because we know that, because we can calculate the changes in the energy level, we can determine which direction the water is going to move. So again, we go back to that picture, and our psi, actually we were over here, if you remember, our psi was negative 100. So we know that the water is going to move from an area of high content or high water potential to an area of more negative water potential. And we just, psi is the symbol that we use for that. As I just mentioned, it flows from high psi to low psi. So at the bottom we had, if you think about it, it was a negative 0.3, which is a high psi. And here we were negative 100. It was more negative. So that's a low psi. So when we have a positive psi, those pressures, that pressure is forcing that water away, kind of like we were talking about where we had a high psi or a more positive psi down at the bottom, and then moving to a more negative psi at the top of that picture. So as I mentioned before, it's kind of like sucking through a straw. The water is going to move up into and then up the straw. So I mentioned before about that megapascal and atmosphere, and no one can agree on which one we need to use, and then you start getting into different exchanges and different moving in between different systems and units. But here in America, we tend to just stick with bars. That's how we determine our pressure. So when you hear me mention about water holding capacity being at negative 0.33 bars, that's also the same as it's at negative 0.33 megapascals. So when our soil is saturated, we have 100% relative humidity, which means that there is no, there's going to be like no evaporation, right? So we have a soil. Here's the top where the grass is. There's enough downward pressure and that humidity that the water will not move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And so our psi would be 0. So as gravity drains some of that water away, our psi will become more negative. And when the soil psi is less than gravity force, that's when the water stops draining. We've reached field capacity. When you move into soils class, we'll go over these a little bit more, but for the most part, what we have is we have gravity psi, which is the downward force, the downward pulling of that water. We have psi with a little g. We have our matrix potential, which is kind of the adhesion and the cohesion between those soil particles and the water. So there's an attraction between that little clay molecule, clay particle, and that water molecule. And then we have osmotic potential. And so this is the dissolved salts in the water. That's where the S comes from, is because it is the salts. So a couple of examples, like if you had an irrigation canal, you would see that some of that water moves, I guess initially would start to move downward, but it would also move laterally into the furrow. One thing that we do run into is that if that soil is very dry, then that matrix potential might not be enough to move that water laterally. And so it might take a little bit more water in order to get some better movement and some coverage of that. So our soils can become kind of hydrophobic if they don't have enough water already in them, because there's no cohesion. So this right here is the adhesion. More water is needed in order to have that cohesion. Now, just another example that I was just talking about was that those dry pots could be difficult to wet with a drip tube, and they have to be done, it has to be done slowly. So here we have drought periods, and our soils get dry, and then all of a sudden we get 3 inches of rain. Most of the rain ends up running off because there's no movement of that water into the soil, because there's no water in the soil for that cohesion. And so there's, as I mentioned, no cohesion to start that capillary action laterally. So capillary action can happen 2 ways. It can happen up and it can happen out. So there's no cohesion to start that capillary action laterally. So you really have to wet that pot good and thorough in order to start establishing that capillarity. One other thing you might be able to do is kind of water from the bottom. That might be something that could, just get a pan and put the pot in the water, and so that capillary rise will also happen from the bottom as well. So here's just a diagram of that irrigation canal, where at first the water is going to move straight down and then out, and then you will also have some capillary action where this water starts to move into the soil this way, and then possibly up there. And then also on the right side, that's kind of showing how that water would move throughout the pot if the soil or the medium is moist, versus how it is if it were just dry. So it will move straight down here, and then once all these. All right, so the osmotic potential, if you recall from previous slide, we had that little S at the bottom of that psi. And what that stands for is the salts that are in the soil water. So those concentrations can prevent water from entering the roots, or even worse, pull water out of the roots, because that salt concentration of your fertilizer is so high that we have this osmotic effect where water will move from an area of high concentration, like in the plant, to an area of low concentration in order to gain that equilibrium. So here this is showing in beaker A, they had the salt, and you can start to see that it's wilting, and it has a little bit of discoloration. Whereas if we put this in beaker B, which has pure water, then that plant seems to grow just fine. And it's because of those high fertilizer concentrations that's going to inhibit that water uptake by the plant. So there may be water there, but the plant can't take it up because the fertilizer has kind of commandeered that and needs that in order to keep that equilibrium and balance. And this is, as I was talking about earlier, where that water can be pulled from the roots and cause a fertilizer burn. So that's another reason why we want to make sure that we're applying water when we apply fertilizer, is so that we can make sure that there's enough balance and that we can dissolve that fertilizer, and that also we don't create that osmotic potential from having a high salt concentration. So as I mentioned before, we have three kind of water points and movement and retention in our soil. So at saturation, obviously, is going to be when all the pores are filled. Field capacity is going to be after the gravitational water has been drained away. And then finally, permanent wilting point is when there's no more water available to be taken up by the plant. So our psi at saturation is going to be 0. And once that rain stops and the water is moving through the soil profile, it'll first move from the large pores and then from the small pores until we finally reach field capacity. So field capacity is going to be somewhere between negative 0.1 and negative 0.3 bars. And that would also be negative 0.1 or negative 0.3 megapascals. So after everything's drained away, whatever is left in that soil above what gravity has pulled is going to be field capacity. And most of that water is going to be contained in the micropores rather than the macropores. So the macropores are going to be large and have a little bit of have more air in there. Again, this goes back to that capillary action, that capillary rise. That the larger the pore size, or actually on the slide it was the larger the diameter of the tube, the less capillary rise, the less that space was filled with water. And if it's not filled with water, then it will be filled with air. And so as soil loss continues, we'll lose some from evaporation, some plant uptake. Will eventually make it to permanent wilting point. And so permanent wilting point is at negative 15 bars. At this point, this is where the matrix potential is much greater than the ability of the plant to take that water in. And so there may be water still there. It's not that it's bone dry. In order to get all the water off of our soil colloids and out of our soil, we would need to place that in an oven at like 105 degrees Celsius in order to remove all of the water from the soil. So there may still be water there, just the plant doesn't have enough pull or enough power to remove that from the soil. And so because of that, the plant will begin to wilt. And so we need to make sure that we have at least some water for our plants to take up. Even if it's just a little bit, as long as it can still take up some water, it won't die. So here we're looking at, this is right close to saturation. This is right close to saturation. We're beginning to move into field capacity, and then finally we are at permanent wilting point, where there is just a small film of water around that soil colloid. And so there's just not enough water there for the plant to pull up, first off. And second, that small film is more attracted to the soil colloid than it would be moving against the gradient for that water potential. So there are formulas for the amount of water that a soil can hold. That's the available water that's available to the plant. And so that is basically going to be field capacity minus the permanent wilting point. And this is going to change among soils because soil is not necessarily uniform. There's a lot of variability in the makeup of the soil and the way that it was formed, some of the structure. So that's not going to be consistent throughout the entire soil profile. It may change. And so here we have a graph, the volume of water along the y-axis and then our soil type along the x-axis. And you see that the available water actually increases as our soil texture increases. So think about when you go to the beach and the water rushes up on the shore, and when it does and moves back, you can see that water drain out of the sand. So there's not enough, there's too many macropores, and so the water cannot be held in the soil or the sand actually. But that as we get closer to our silt loams and our clays, that we're going to have more available water because it's holding more water in those micropores. So we discussed this a little bit about plant water moving from the soil all the way up until the top of that tree. And that energy is going to be the gradient that develops that soil plant air continuum. And so this is all going to be part of the hydrologic cycle as well. And so under normal conditions, the psi in the roots is less than that in the soil, and that is why that water moves first into the root and then up through the plant. Up those capillary tubes. So the xylem is actually would be very, very small, have a very small diameter. Now remember, we're talking at the cellular level. Remember a couple units ago, we were talking about the xylem and the phloem and the tissue and then the organs and all that. So those cells are very small, and so the smaller the cells, the smaller the tube, the greater the rise. So not only do we have the matrix potential, or the water potential being greater outside the plant that is forcing that water, but we'll also have the smallness of the xylem, the diameter of that xylem being very small, so that water moves up very quickly. And so it's able to do that through those cohesion and tension, adhesion as well. So it's adhesion to the side of the walls, cohesion to the water. We have this water potential that's much more negative in the atmosphere, negative 100 bars compared to negative 0.3 bars in the soil. And so that water is moving up that plant very quickly, relatively, right? Think about it, like it still does take some time for it to move up, but we have all these forces working on that soil water to get through the plant that ultimately comes out the top through transpiration. Along with that, because that water moves, that is how our minerals are able to move into the different parts of the plant. The more soluble the mineral, so we need that water movement to bring those minerals into the plant and then up to the various parts that are going to utilize those nutrients, which is going to be, we'll discuss this in chapter 13. Chapter 13. So transpiration is going to be the flow of water from the roots to the uppermost leaves. And so this is again kind of the same way that our bodies transpire. And so as it gets hot, we start to sweat. That water is cooling us down, so we think, right? Even though it's still hot, but the humidity is so much that that sweat actually beads up on our skin. I don't know if you've ever been anywhere out west, like Arizona. Arizona is hot, I've been there. It's 115 degrees, and 115 degrees is 115. I don't care where you go. But because there's no humidity, the sweat evaporates faster than we can see it beat up than we would here. And being from Mississippi, where it's really humid, it may only be 100 degrees, but it's 100% humidity, and so that's what the transpiration of that water out of our pores, there's nowhere for it to go. So it beads up and it's sweat, and then that's how come, that's the difference between being in the South versus being in the West. It's a dry heat, hot's hot, okay? So that evaporation is going to occur through the leaf mesophyll cells and then move out of the stomates. So our stomates are what are going to open and close, that are going to kind of regulate the influx of carbon dioxide. But when that stomate is open, we also have that evaporation of water. And so there's this balance between, we need this carbon dioxide in order to do photosynthesis. We also need that water in order to do photosynthesis. So our stomates are constantly trying to maintain this balance between bringing in the carbon dioxide, which it needs in order to make sugars so that it can live, and we also need that water as well. So plant-water relations are a big thing. So as our mesophyll side decreases, water will be pulled from adjacent mesophyll cells and lowering their side. And so remember, water is going to move from area of high content to low content. So as we start to decrease the water content in, let's say, this mesophyll cell, in this mesophyll cell, water will move over there, right? Ultimately, that pressure makes it to the roots, and then the roots will then start to pull water from the soil. As I mentioned before, that transpiration is going to be our temperature regulator. So evaporative cooling, we'll need that evaporated water from the surrounding air, and that's going to lower the temperature of the surrounding area, including the leaf. And so one thing I'd like for y'all to consider that, let me see if I can find a piece of paper. Something I'd like for y'all to consider is that this may be like the thickness of a leaf, right? And so we're not talking about this temperature cooling the surrounding area as in like all the area around it, right? Like it can only cool so much. So you have to think about that on this leaf blade, we're talking on, I mean, that boundary layer is nanometers, micrometers. Like the area that we're talking about cooling is just right above that, just surrounding that leaf blade. We have this big old atmosphere out here that's still hot, but the plant, as long as there's wind movement as well, so even just a little bit of wind movement across the plant is going to increase the boundary layer so that the plant can then cool. So we really only need this much area around a plant leaf in order to maintain that temperature. So we talked about that we have the mesophyll cell, and one mesophyll cell says to the other one, I don't have enough water, can I borrow some from you? That mesophyll cell borrows some from another one. We have this chain reaction down the plant till it finally gets to the roots. So that soil water not being available sends a signal to the stomates, and the stomates then go, we need to conserve water. And so they're gonna close to conserve that water and reduce that transpiration. Think about this though, when they close, they're also not bringing in carbon dioxide. And so if they're not bringing in carbon dioxide, they're not conducting photosynthesis for a couple of reasons. Number one, carbon dioxide is the main thing, is the primary component for photosynthesis, but there's also not enough water available to conduct photosynthesis. And so it's kind of like a survival mechanism, because it needs the water to transport and move some of those nutrients around throughout the plant so that it can kind of survive until it gets more water, until we can get to another rainfall. And so you can kind of think of this as like how we eat. That if we know there's not going to be food for a while, like our bodies can make it on what little nutrients are there. So we might be able to make it a day, maybe 2 days without eating, just stretching it a little bit. So the same thing with the plants. There's enough nutrients in the plant to maybe make it 1 or 2 more days until they can get to some more water. And if they don't get any more water, eventually the nutrients start to decline, because now they're not pulling any nutrients up out of the soil. So there's this big loop, and maybe if you take water out of the equation, because plants are 90% water, they end up dying. And then also, if we reduce that transpiration, now the plants start to overheat. If we couldn't sweat, our bodies would, our body temperature would increase. And so because they had that water in there, they're able to absorb more heat, and they can also, that'll give them time before they get critically hot. So we need to make sure that we have water in the plant to stop it from overheating. It's also going to, that's how they get their nutrients. So we also need that water in there to kind of create this turgor pressure, so that it's going to kind of fill out our cells and let that plant stay upright. So if we start to take all the water out of the cells, our plants start to shrivel and wilt. Because there's insufficient water to create that turgor pressure, which is why we get to permanent wilting point. If there's no water in the soil and there's reached permanent wilting point, which was how many bars? What was permanent wilting point? -15. So if we get permanent wilting point, the plants will start to wilt because they can't get any water, and they decrease that turgor pressure in the cells. So along with that, so the mineral concentrations inside the plant cells may be much greater than what is in the soil. And so because we have transpiration when we have that straw, the straw sucking that water out, those nutrients are coming in regardless of the mineral concentration in the plant. So that's kind of that osmotic effect. And so to go against osmosis, we need that absorption and translocation of minerals through that water uptake and actual transpiration. Like we couldn't just draw the nutrients in just a little bit. We need to make sure that that is pulling them all the way up so that it's a continuous system. Of course, this takes energy in order to do that. And so most of that energy is going to come from the carbohydrates. And we call this active transport. And so these minerals are going to be brought in by special carrier proteins that are going to kind of encapsulate the ion, whether it be a cation or an anion, and allow that to come into the plant. Now there's also passive transport too. So here we have a potassium ion that comes into the cell. It's now through the cell wall, this carrier, see the shape for that ion, and then basically it just turns in and allows that to go into the cytoplasm where that nutrient can then be used as need be to perform those functions. For potassium, it's going to be mostly an enzyme activity. So we have to kind of think about these things as we're trying to figure out what is the problem with our plant. Why are we not getting nutrients to the plant? What are the potential reasons? That's kind of what our whole agricultural career is about. We're also going to need that water in order to transport some of those sugars. So not only is it going to go up the plant, but it will also continue to move down and through the plant. And we've discussed this before, that water moves up the plant through the xylem, and then primarily down the plant through the phloem, but can also move laterally. Through active transport. So that diffusion is going to be slow, and that cytoplasmic streaming is really going to kind of determine what the rate of uptake is going to be. We have our xylem with our upward movement, which is very rapid, and then we have phloem with our mass flow. That is going to be our passive uptake. It's just coming in no matter what, because there's just a lot in there, which can be multi-directional and rapid. All right, so that's going to end water relations, and I will see you in the next chapter. We're almost there. Hang in there, all right?